Hi, everybody. Coming up on this edition of the Baseball Beat, I talked to Paul Hensler, who has been able to combine his passion for writing, for history, for baseball, into being an author. He has written several books, including several about baseball. So we will get to our interview coming up with Paul Hensler, in addition to some comments on what's going on in baseball next, right here on the Baseball Beat.
Welcome to the Baseball Beat with your host, Dan Lovallo.
Well, in just a moment, we are going to play an interview I had with Paul Hensler earlier in the week, and we are putting this podcast together on Friday, August the 14th. And Paul has been able to combine his passion for writing, baseball, and history into being an outstanding author of several books, including several books on baseball. So we'll get to that interview in just a moment. A couple of stories making news. Actually, there's always a lot of stories making news when it comes to baseball. It appears as if the St. Louis Cardinals, who haven't played a baseball game since late July because of COVID, will finally be returning to action. And they're going to be playing a lot of baseball games. They've got doubleheaders scheduled, for example, against the Chicago Cubs, 3 doubleheaders against the Chicago Cubs, in addition to doubleheaders against several other clubs. And they still don't believe they'll be able to get in the entire 60 games. The way it has been presented, the Cardinals will play 58 games between August the 15th and the end of the season. And then if they need to play the remaining 2 games to get into the playoffs, or if it has an effect on the standings, then they'll play those 2 games after the end of the regular season. So it's just been crazy what's going on with the Cardinals. How about Zack Greinke, the pitcher for the Houston Astros, purposely letting the San Francisco Giants know which pitches were coming in a game earlier this week, and the Astros still won the game. And this, of course, was a play on the fact that the Astros were stealing signs and it was helping the Houston batters. You know the whole story there. But Greinke wanted to prove that sometimes it doesn't matter if you know which pitches are coming. And so he was telling the Giants pitchers, or the Giants hitters, these are the pitches that are coming. And like I said, he still won the game. I've had a lot of hitters tell me over the years they don't want to know which pitch is coming, that it really plays mind games with them, that they would rather just go up there with a strategy in their mind, not being affected in any way by knowing which pitch is going to come. And I definitely understand that. I really do. But that's another story making news, and so many other stories as well. My goodness, the Boston Red Sox, they just can't win a game. I mean, the Red Sox, for example, they got swept by Tampa Bay. These are the Red Sox who won the World's Championship in 2018. In the last 2 seasons in Fenway Park, Tampa Bay has a 13-1 record against the Red Sox. 13-1. I mean, if you're Boston, 1-13 against Tampa Bay in your own ballpark the last 2 years, I mean, those are numbers reminiscent of the 1962 New York Mets. And poor Ron Roenicke. I know the Red Sox have this blueprint of essentially not tearing the whole thing up, but tearing a lot of the blueprint up and starting anew. Obviously, their pitching staff has been decimated by injuries, but things are tough right now in Boston. And who could have expected this 22 months after the Red Sox had a record-breaking season and won the World Series against the Dodgers? Just certainly amazing. All right, I want to get to the interview now I did with Paul Hensler. Well, joining me on the Baseball Beat is someone who has been a guest on the Baseball Beat before, author Paul Hensler, who has a passion for history, baseball, writing. He has written several books. He has also written numerous articles, including for the Society for American Baseball Research. So he's definitely no stranger to the Baseball Beat. And Paul, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Dan. I wish we could be doing this at Dunkin' Donuts Park, but circumstances aren't allowing that.
Well, you've got that right. In fact, when we interviewed you at Dunkin' Donuts Park, we interviewed you on your latest book, Bob Steele on the Radio, The Life of Connecticut's beloved broadcaster. And how has that book gone for you?
It's gone well up until COVID shut everything down. I had some really terrific appearances with that. As you can imagine, you have to be sort of a certain age to have a definite recall of who Bob Steele was. So I spoke at a fair number of senior centers, but the very enthusiastic crowds, a couple of historical societies. Weathersfield, of course, he lived in Weathersfield for many, many years, and their historical society in town was happy to host me. Several senior centers locally, I think off the top of my head, South Windsor, Glastonbury. I just did a Zoom last week with the folks in West Hartford, which was nice. That this was the first leap from just going to all canceled appearances to now we can finally do something online and reach out to a definitive audience. Again, I think my last gig actually appearing in person live was the beginning of February, and they were kind of scattered throughout the spring, and we already had some things booked into the fall that have had to have been canceled or rescheduled. But I was very heartened by the reception that I got for the book. The Connecticut Historical Society was wonderful. I walked into their little auditorium, and they had a whole bunch of chairs set up, and before that they had a table with cheese and crackers and veggie platter with dip, and there was wine available over here. And I'm just not used to things like that. You walk in and you talk to like 10 people or so. That's kind of the normal what I think of. But they had a very elaborate setup for it. And they also found in their archives, they had some old audio recordings that they actually had of Bob Steele from his radio program. They're actually playing that just sort of as background music. And they ended up creating a podcast out of that too. So I was very, very happy for the people out there that they gave me the royal treatment as far as I'm concerned as an author making an appearance there. But again, with COVID and speaking at so many senior centers, that's really been put on the back burner now for quite some time. I'm hoping that as things progress through the fall, if things kind of return to normal, that I'll be able to get back and do some in-person appearances for them.
I want to ask you about some of the baseball books you have written, Paul, and they are available on Amazon. They get high ratings on Amazon, by the way, but they're available in several areas, including Amazon. One of the books you have written is The American League in Transition, 1965 to 1975, How Competition Thrived When the Yankees Didn't. And that's a particular era that has always fascinated me, because that's when I really became a baseball fan. I remember baseball in the early 60s when the Yankees dominated. I grew up a Yankees fan, but that 65 to 66 period, particularly when the Yankees did a nosedive, always fascinates me. So that said, talk a bit about that book.
I had a very bad falling out with baseball as a result of the strike in 1994. And I was one of these guys, I read the Sporting News cover to cover. I planned vacations around it. And I was very upset with the strike in 94 that lasted into 95. So my fandom kind of really tailed off. But nonetheless, after I did work on my master's degree at Trinity College, I finished all my work there in 2007. It had been about 4 or 5 months. I realized, I haven't written anything in quite some time. And the thought that went through my mind was exactly this particular period that would crop up in my head every once in a while, like, the Yankees dominated so much, but then they had this interregnum, if you will, from 65 to 1975, where they didn't win anything. And I decided, well, I haven't written anything about baseball, and I've, kind of been disaffected by the strike, but maybe this is worth exploring just kind of for chuckles. So I started putting the research together on that. And I had written, I would say, 2 extensive chapters, and I was working on a third very deep chapter, and I finally got the contract for that book. And not having any experience writing a book, they came back to me, and McFarland was the publisher, and the editor got back to me and he said, at the rate you're going, this is going to be, some astronomical amount of words, because I was really getting into a lot of detail. I found old Sporting News articles talking about Jimmy Hall growing up in the cotton mills of the Carolinas, that sort of thing. And I was including all this because, I just didn't really have a roadmap for any of this. I was just having a lot of fun with it. So they got back to me and said, well, should probably trim things back. So I had to extensively cut 2 chapters and then continued on with the rest of the book. But what I found in this period was that you had the Minnesota Twins, sort of a very, very loose dynasty, if you will. They won the World Series in 65. they blew the pennant really the last weekend of the 1967 season, but then after the league split with expansion 69, they won the first 2 American League West titles. So they had kind of this nebulous dynasty, if you will, over a couple of years. And then, of course, I segue from their team history right into the Baltimore Orioles, which were just really developing a powerhouse at that time. They win the World Series very unexpectedly in 1966. Earl Weaver comes in midway through the 68 season. Of course, he creates his own legacy with the very powerful teams that the Orioles had from 69 to 71, in which they appeared in the World Series each year. But then they also won divisional titles in 73 and 74. So the formative years under Earl Weaver at that time were very important to this particular limited time frame of 65 to 75. And then, of course, I segue from that right into the Oakland Athletics, who moved from Kansas City and to very shrewd drafting and some shrewd trades that they made. Wonderful farm system that produced Rollie Fingers and Joe Rudy, that level of that caliber of personalities. They become a very formative team in themselves, and they win 5 titles from 71 to 75, including 3 straight in the World Series. So I did have enough material to put this together. I'm not sure what the word count ended up being, but I find in doing the work with this, there's a little bit of run out. I like the title ending with 1975, but you can't just tell the story of the Oakland Athletics and end it right at that particular point, because everybody abandoned ship after 1976 because the reserve clause was struck down. So I have a little bit of run out in the final chapter. I think I labeled that chapter the diaspora, because it really was this this clutch of players, that especially the prime free agents, that they just dispersed right after the 1976 season. So that was a lot of fun to write. And then for my second book, the New Boys of Summer, I trimmed that down. I broadened the subjects, if you will, but narrowed the focus time-wise, because so much was taking place in 1968 and 1969. We had an old commissioner was finally jettisoned, who was incompetent to begin with, William Eckert. Bowie Kuhn comes into office. We have the rules changes because 1968 became really so pitching dominant that they realized they have to do something to spark the offense on the part of baseball, generally speaking. And of course, we have the expansion that brings the 4 divisions into play, AL West and AL East, and the same configuration in the National League. So there's so many dynamic changes that took place right at that particular time, right at the very end of the 60s. And of course, I deal with societal issues at that time. You have players who are being called to military service because Vietnam is still raging at that time. We have, there's political fallout, there's racial issues. So I had a lot of fun researching it, because I always wanted to write something about the 1960s. I didn't know exactly what that would be, but with 2 books now dealing with those particulars, it was a lot of fun for me. It's something that I lived through myself and was able to revisit and actually put on the page. So it was a very enjoyable project. Both of those were very enjoyable projects.
So getting back to the first book for just a moment, the American League in Transition, how much of a price did the American League play by being slower to integrate than the National League?
They paid a very dear price, because stepping back even before that particular time frame, you had the Negro League stars, or those black players who would have naturally segued to the Negro Leagues, such as Henry Aaron and Ernie Banks, other players, the great players like Jackie Robinson, of course, but also Don Newcomb and, of course, Roy Campanella. The National League got the jump on it, and I would attribute this to the fact that because the Dodgers were a National League team, that other National League teams wanted to not fall behind as quickly, but because integration was slower in the American League. Larry Doby debuts not that long after Jackie Robinson, but his first trial with the Indians was not very successful. So I think that perhaps maybe generated a little bit of reluctance on the part of other American League teams to jump in so quickly. But the National League was more quick to act, and thus you had teams like the Dodgers, who brought in the big 3. You had Robinson, Campanella, and Don Newcomb. Ernie Banks goes to the Cubs. Henry Aaron gets signed off the Sandlots, and he ends up with the Milwaukee Braves. So by getting the jump on that and realizing the benefit of having superior players like this join the roster, that this helped them really immeasurably. And that was always one of you probably recall this too, as you got through the 1960s, it always seemed like the National League was winning the All-Star game every year. And of course, just in this conversation too, don't overlook the contributions of Roberto Clemente also. So again, the minority players really coming on board and making their mark in the National League. I still think Clemente is probably one of the most underrated superstars of all time. Somebody just had a debate on Facebook a couple of days ago talking about if you're picking a right fielder, Frank Robinson versus Roberto Clemente. And I think I'd sacrifice power and I go with Clemente because his defensive skills were just, superior to almost anybody that roamed the outfield. So I would probably give the nod to Clemente on that. But again, the National League getting the jump on being able to have making sure that they sign more minority players that I think it certainly benefited them more in the long run.
It's not so surprising then when the Minnesota Twins developed this almost dynasty in the 60s because they had minority players, Zoilo Versalles, Tony Oliva, and Earl Batty as examples.
Yes, Camilo Pascual,
yes.
Kind of a loose cannon as a pitcher, but he finally was able to harness not only his energy but his emotions too. He's a very emotional player. When things didn't go right, he was stalking around the mound and that sort of thing. And once he got that in check, he was able to reach premier status. Let's not forget Mudcat Grant also joined that team in 1964, and they just had this bent to scout players and sign them from Cuba. And absolutely, Tony Oliva, had he not had such poor knees, he would almost certainly be in the Hall of Fame. There was a guy who could hit for power. He went from being a terrible fielder. He actually won a Gold Glove in 1966, I think. Again, not in the Clemente class, but nonetheless, just one of the fearsome hitters of his time. And again, that willingness to embrace bringing minority players into the fold certainly helped them immensely, and that paid a dividend for them too. Not to be overlooked, the guy putting the spurs to the Twins in 1965 was none other than third base coach Billy Martin. And he said when he was appointed coach, he said, "Okay, get ready because you guys are going to run." And he turned them into a very aggressive team, which certainly served to the benefit. He also that also became a learning experience for him too, because he realized that somebody like a Zoilo Versalles, who had somewhat of a fragile temperament, he could take a dressing down as long as he didn't do it in public. And Billy Martin would dress him down because he worked extensively with the infielders. He was, a very fearsome middle infielder as a second baseman for the Yankees and some other teams as well. And he schooled people like Jerry Kindle and Versalles. So teaching them the finer points of defensive play in the infield and having that aggressive mindset. I had the opportunity to interview Jerry Kindle for that first book, in fact, and he was very frank on this. He said never met anybody with so brilliant a baseball mind as Billy Martin.
Now, you have submitted your manuscript for another book. Talk a bit about that.
Yes, and that's the book about the time frame 1977 to 1989. My working title for it is Catching Baseball Fever, because attendance in baseball really took a huge upswing in this particular time frame. It was very important as far as baseball overall, because from the late 1960s into the 1970s, there was this great fear that professional football is really going to supplant baseball as, we want to call it this again, the national pastime. So this was very important in terms of baseball economics, but so many people, owners in particular, thought with free agency coming in, now that the reserve clause has been struck down, this is just going to be the ruination of the game. We're going to have teams like the Angels and the Yankees and the Dodgers, all the well-money teams are going to play checkbook baseball. They're going to turn a blind eye to their farm system because as soon as a prime player is eligible for free agency, they're just going to sign him for more money than anybody else could possibly afford. And in actuality, that turned out not to be the case. The Yankees certainly took advantage of it early and had championship teams up to 1981, but through the rest of the 1980s and well into 1990s, they did not win very much. So we had surprisingly competitive balance by other lesser teams, if we will. You had the Minnesota Twins winning a World Series, the Detroit Tigers having some great teams, and of course, the Los Angeles Dodgers, they still leaned more toward producing through their farm system. So despite free agency creating such a financial windfall for the players, teams didn't go bankrupt. It did take them a while to warm up to have revenue sharing, as an important part to support the smaller market teams. That did come with time, but it took a while for baseball to come on board before they did so the way that professional football and basketball and hockey did. That took a lot of time. But nonetheless, this is one of the most formative periods in baseball history, that from 1977 to 1989, which is my time frame, there's a lot going on behind the scenes in baseball that bolstered its, not just bolstered its popularity, but the marketing of the game itself, that put all these logoed products, all these licensed products in the hands of so many fans. This went hand in hand with it too. You're not only rooting for your team, but I can wear a special jacket, I can wear a special T-shirt, and all the household products that came on board. This was all part of the excitement that contributed to this baseball fever. That was all part of their baseball's own marketing campaign. Baseball fever, catch it. And that's how I've kind of spun my main title around that a little bit, because we were, everybody in general speaking, for fans, they were really catching fever at that time.
When can we look forward to the book coming out?
Oh boy, I wish I could answer that. Usually the time frame from manuscript submission, if it's 1 year, it's not unusual. My Bob Steele book really took the fast track for whatever reason, I don't know. That was something like around 7 months or so from start to finish, but I don't anticipate this being quite that quick a turnaround. Optimistically, I would hope by next spring, because a lot of new baseball books come out in the spring. But having just submitted it in early August, I wouldn't be surprised if it might be next summer until it actually comes out. So I hate to commit on that. I know it's a question everybody has, and when can we look forward to this? But that's unfortunately the best answer I can give you right now.
Well, and it's tough to commit because publishers have been known to change the date as well, haven't they?
Publishers can change the date. In fact, I was trying to get a hold of my editor, Roman and Littlefield, for this last book, and had kind of a double whammy. I didn't realize this, but as I started to contact her, sending her statuses as I was going through research in the book in the late winter and early spring, I learned that she was going to be out on maternity leave until early April. And then, of course, all the offices were shut down because of COVID, and I did not know what their work-at-home arrangements were. And I finally heard from an assistant that works with her, and I felt relief there because I knew things weren't just going off into the black hole of cyberspace of emails and such that I sent asking questions. But I was a little bit apprehensive. I knew something was going to finally gel at some point in time once the world started to reopen. I guess they're actively back in their office now. So I was in contact with her quite a bit last week and purchased my pictures from the Hall of Fame. That was another minor holdup too, is that I've got all the narrative, all the paperwork, if you will, ready to go, but I was waiting for the Hall of Fame because they had to purchase pictures from the Hall of Fame. Their offices were closed, and when they reopened, they were only open 3 days a week. So I was just in line with everybody else waiting to get the request processed. But the photo archivist, John Horn, up there, he took very good care of me, and we got the pictures resolved pretty quickly once he had access to them, and those were all submitted as well. So the publisher, Roman and Littlefield, has everything that they need at this time, but these are the behind-the-scenes agenda items that people aren't really aware of, or what goes into creating a book.
Well, I could go on for hours chatting with you. We'll have you back, and we'll definitely have you back when the book comes out. But I want to thank you very much for spending some time out of your busy day to be a guest on the Baseball Beat.
And I appreciate it, too. I know that we don't have baseball in Hartford, and I reached out to you, as a matter of fact, because that was a prompt from my publisher. They sent a very extensive 25-question questionnaire that they're trying to position the book for marketing purposes and whatnot. And one of those questions, and you were part of the answer, was name some media contacts so that we can get word out about the book. So that was my reason for reaching out to you, and I appreciate your quick and enthusiastic reply.
Well, I thank you for thinking of me, for sure. Well, that is going to do it for the Baseball Beat. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We are in the Apple Podcast Directory, Google's Podcast Directory, all of the major podcast directories. Go to my website, thebaseballbeat.com, for the podcast, or you can go to danlovallo.com. And if you would like to email me, my email address is dan@danlovallo.com. And as always, thanks for listening to The Baseball Beat.